This is called Weird Things Are Happening to My Apartment in Taipei. I've been living in Taipei for 2 months so far, and until last week, everything had been going great. I was fresh out of college and managed to get a job as an English teacher in a foreign city. The food here is fantastic and cheap, and the people are all very friendly. The job came to me with pretty short notice, so I had to get an apartment in short order. I still managed to find an apartment in the Shiling district, where the school I work at is located, but it is a pretty old and shabby apartment. But the rent was low and the location was great for me to get to work, so I wasn't too picky and put my newly minted seal on the lease. I hadn't done much to the apartment since arriving and had basically still been living out of my luggage, using the place only to sleep and shower. My apartment was on the third floor of an old block sandwiched between a bicycle repair shop and an empty building that didn't have any signboards put up. The inside of my apartment wasn't much better either. The floor of the apartment was tiled with tiles that were probably white once, and the landlord provided some furniture. There was a table with a single rickety wooden chair, a bed frame without a mattress, I had to buy that myself, a cupboard, and a closet that I didn't get around to using for the first 2 months. I can tell that the landlord tried to clean up the main areas of the apartment, so most of the living spaces and the tiny kitchen were free of dirt and dust, but all the nooks and crannies under the cupboards, behind the closet, and under the sink were all really dirty. Then last weekend, I decided to clean the apartment and get my house life in order. I really regret that decision now. I bought a broom, mop, and cleaning agents from the supermarket nearby, stripped down to a comfy pair of shorts and t shirt, and got working on my apartment. I scrubbed the stains off the walls and dusted the cupboard and the closet. I wiped the windows as best I could so they were mostly transparent again. I got all the dust out of the lights and the place became twice as bright. I stripped off the yellowing calendar and other likewise yellowing decorations pasted on the wall. There were some old newspapers and expired canned food in the kitchen cabinets, which I threw away. Some really old clothes that were basically rags were also left on top of the closet, collecting dust. These I also dumped. It took me the entire morning and afternoon before I managed to get the place into a habitable state. I must have used dozens of buckets of water. It was unbelievable how hard it was to clean the apartment, even though it was so small. Then, that night, the nightmare started. I dreamed that there was a woman sitting at the foot of my bed, looking at me. She was dressed in red, and I couldn't see her face from the dim street lights shining through the drawn curtains of my window. She sat very still and never moved. I couldn't move or make a sound either. This doesn't sound so scary as far as nightmares go. There were no monsters, no ghosts, no demons, just a woman sitting in the dim light. But the nightmare lasted for hours and hours, and I was conscious for every minute of it, frozen, paralyzed as this woman stared at me, and I was unable to do anything about it. There are no sounds coming from outside the apartment. Nothing moved. Usually, things happen really quickly in my dreams. I'd always be doing something. Never had I had a dream that was so still, so quiet, with nothing except a single woman dressed in red looking at me. In my dream, I closed my eyes so I didn't need to look at her, but every time I opened my eyes again, she would always be there, and the dream refused to end. In the end, I stopped trying to close my eyes and wish her away and just waited as the hours slowly passed by. I was only suddenly wrenched out of my dream when my alarm rang. One moment, I was in the dark with a woman, and the next, I was gasping awake, my pajamas and the bedsheets soaked with my sweat. I also realized that I'd wet my bed, but I was too shaken to have been embarrassed. This nightmare happened again the next day, and then the next, and I stopped trying to go to sleep in my apartment. After work ended at 5 p.m. on the fourth day, I went to the staff restroom and took a long nap on the couch. The nap lasted 4 hours, and it was nighttime by the time I woke up. I had no dreams and slept soundly. I was so relieved I actually shed a few tears. Back in my apartment, I turned up all the lights and settled down to a big mug of really strong coffee. It was instant coffee, and I must have poured in 3 times as many scoops as I normally do, but I was determined not to go to sleep that night. I sat in my chair instead and alternated between reading my basic Chinese textbook and watching YouTube videos. My strategy was going really well until sometime near midnight. Suddenly, I smelled really heavy perfume in the air. It was a mix of jasmine and roses, and smelled like someone came into my apartment and emptied an entire bottle of rose water and perfume into it. I got up from the chair and tried to investigate where the smell was coming from. All my windows were closed, so it wasn't from outside. Maybe it was coming from outside and seeping in from under the door. The entire apartment was permeated with it, and the flowery scent was getting very overbearing. Suddenly, I found myself in the nightmare again. I can't explain how it happened. One moment, I was looking around my very brightly lit apartment, and the next moment, I found myself in the dark, on my bed, being stared at by a woman whose face I couldn't make out. I was petrified. I thought I had finally beaten the nightmare. I wanted to cry. Why was this happening to me? What did I do so wrong to deserve this? But the sobs couldn't come out of my closed mouth, and the tears just slowly slid down my face from my eyes. The nightmare lasted for hours, just like the previous nights, and I was only wrenched awake by the sound of my alarm from my phone. I was in bed, even though I didn't remember getting into bed that night. Thank God I had remembered to plug the phone in last night to charge. I shuddered to think what would have happened if my battery had died. Would I not have woken up from the nightmare? This gave me an idea. The next day, I slept at the office again and drank 3 cups of the double espressos from the 24/7 convenience store near my apartment. Then I took out my phone and set my alarm. All my alarms. I set an alarm for every half hour between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. If the alarm was the antidote to the nightmares, then I'd just have it forcibly wrench me out of the nightmares instead of having to wait for hours before it ends. I grew really nervous as midnight drew closer and put on a really loud YouTube comedy playlist on my computer to prevent myself from falling asleep. Then I suddenly smelled the heavy scent of flowers permeate my apartment again. But this time I felt prepared. This time I felt like I had beaten the game. I found myself suddenly in the nightmare again, in the dark, on my bed, with a woman sitting at the foot of my bed. But even though I still couldn't move, I was almost smug. I stared right back at her as though challenging her. I was going to beat this nightmare. Then, something happened that made all my confidence and bravado evaporate. It was such a simple thing to do, but I didn't think it was possible for her to do it. She moved. She tilted her head so the lower half of her face was lit up in the dim light, and she smiled. Her thin lips curled up into a slight smile as she continued staring at me. I was terrified all over again and waited for the alarm to bring me out of the nightmare. But it never came. I waited for hours and hours in the dark, watching her as she smiled at me, and the alarm didn't come. Just as I thought I was going to go crazy from fright, I was suddenly wrenched out of the nightmare by the sound of my phone's alarm. I was lying in my bed again, but in the waking world with all my apartment lights turned on and the comedy video blaring out of my computer. I was so relieved, I was so glad that I didn't notice how something was off. It was only when I turned off my phone's alarm that I noticed the time. 12:30 a.m. All that time, all those hours I spent terrified in my nightmare was only half an hour in the waking world. I broke down in tears, finally able to sob. I only snapped out of my sobbing when I noticed that the smell of roses and jasmine was gathering in the air again, and I panicked. No, not again, not so soon. I grabbed my keys, wallet, and phone and dashed out of the apartment. I left the YouTube videos blaring in my room as I quickly descended the dusty flights of stairs and went down to the empty street. I first headed to the 24/7 convenience store and spent about half an hour there staring at the cup noodles and rows of drinks to calm my nerves. The cashier seemed a bit suspicious of me for spending so long in the store, but I didn't care. I bought a USB phone charger at the store because I left mine at the apartment and I was not going back there. Another cup of double shot espresso, and searched for a nearby hourly hotel on my phone. I found one within walking distance and stayed there for the night with the lights turned on. It is finally the weekend again, but I do not dare go back to my apartment. I bought new clothes and I'm living at a hotel instead. I'm in the hotel room right now typing this, trying to see if anyone has any answers and suggestions for what to do. Should I see a psychiatrist? But I slept normally in my office and in the hotel, so it can't have anything to do with me. It's only my apartment. Did I do anything wrong when I cleaned my apartment? Did I disturb something in my apartment as I was scrubbing the nooks and crannies? Maybe I threw something away that I was not supposed to. I'm trying to remember everything I got rid of, and nothing seems important. There was a whole stack of newspapers that were at least 5 years old. The one on top was from the year 99, and I know that Taiwan starts counting its years from 1912. I can barely read Chinese, so I didn't know what the newspaper headlines were. Maybe they were important? The calendar and decorations were old too. The calendar was for the year 102, which was 4 years ago, and was only half used up. And there were some small pieces of calligraphy on very yellowed paper that were glued so firmly I had to rip them in order to get them off the walls. The old clothes were really tattered, but their fit was for a man's clothes and not a woman's. They were just plain gray shirts that were moth-eaten and covered in dust. I didn't think twice when I threw them away. Maybe I shouldn't have. I couldn't tell what was in the old cans of food I dumped because I didn't read Chinese, but they had pictures of beans on them and had expired more than a year ago. Honestly, what else was I supposed to do with them? I left a message for my landlord, but he hasn't replied yet. Maybe I ought to find another apartment and have someone else pack up my things and bring them to me. I just hope the nightmares don't follow me. I don't know what to do right now. What's my best option? So that's the end of the story, and I will read one person's comment that I think is a fair assessment of what's happening. The yellow decorations are not decoration, but some sort of seals to ward off something. And then someone else commented, yeah, what that guy said. And she's dressed in red, which is like the worst kind of Chinese ghost to encounter because they've died a wrongful death and have become vengeful as a result. You should go to a temple or church immediately and ask for assistance.
Oh shit. Did you ever watch this show? There's an online show on Paramount Plus called Evil, and it's basically like, okay, so
No.
basically at every episode they explore a case that is brought to the Catholic Church, and it's considered a supernatural case, but they hired a staff psychologist to interrogate those cases to see if they're like a scientific explanation for some of the things. And each episode ends kind of like inconclusively. Like it's always like, you can't really tell. I would like to offer, those buildings are really old. My aunt lives in one of them, and it is highly questionable what is in the build materials. And I would say that if you like deep clean something like that, it's possible you can disturb asbestos paint, lead paint, mold, all those kinds of things that can cause like really vivid like hallucinations and like crazy experiences. But you can't prove that unless you test for it. So, but yeah, that is
Jesse,
like,
always on the opposite side of the woo-woo spectrum, going all sciencey over here. I definitely agree with the commenter. I think the what she called yellow paper with calligraphy on them that were glued so hard into the wall. Definitely, I feel like those were supposed
oh
to
my
be
god.
like warding away the evil, and then she ripped it off.